Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ego and ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. Right, so what am I doing in this episode? This is Meister Eckhart Selected Writings. Yeah, I felt like starting something new. If you're wondering why I've been slowing down my content recently, it's because I'm trying to learn video editing, which is spending a bit of time with that. But I'm going to keep going with producing content. Don't worry. Yeah. So just before we get going, publishing details. So this is This is Johannes Eckhart, I think, or otherwise known as Meister Eckhart. This is a Penguin Classics book. And it was published in this translation, first published in 1994. Yeah. And translated and edited with an introduction by Oliver Davies. Yeah. So without further ado, I'm going to get going. So, all right. Do I do the introduction? I think I will. I think this will be helpful. Meister Eckhart, an introduction to his life and thought. Meister Eckhart fascinates us today, as he did many of his contemporaries, and yet there are few medieval thinkers whose thought is so complex and challenging, and so easily misunderstood. There is in Eckhart's system a complexity, first of all, depth in that he explores many of the great technical themes in medieval theology, such as theory of analogy, metaphysics of image, constitution of the human soul, epistemology, which is theory of knowledge, and ontology, theory of being. But there is in Eckhart's work no less a contemporary, complexity of service, which results from his brilliant use of imagery and virtuistic ability to manipulate the forms and structures of language in order to communicate a metaphysical vision. It is primarily in these rhetorical skills that we see Eckhart's great originality, and we experience the metaphysical passion which makes Meister Eckhart stand out as one of the most exciting and radical thinkers of his own, or indeed any age. Meister Eckhart, the Dominican, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Life. Eckhart was born around 1260 and joined the Dominican priory in nearby Erfurt, probably around 15 years of age. Enjoying the friar's preacher, he was following a well-trodden path, which would guarantee him an education commensurate with his ability, the opportunity to study, to teach, and to travel. Eckhart appears to have followed the Dominican route typical of the best students of his time. He may have undertaken his early studies of arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, either in his native Germany or possibly in Paris, which was the principal center of medieval academic excellence. But he was certainly in Paris as a reader of the sentences in 1294. As the title suggests, he was engaged at this time in studying Peter Lombard's Sentences, which was the main textbook of the medieval ages that formed the basis of intermediate theological studies. He left Paris soon after to serve as the prior of the Dominican house in Erfurt, where he wrote his early talks of instruction and perhaps a number of early sermons, including sermons 1 and 2 of the present selection. The talks of instruction, which are included here, are an important testimony to the relative maturity of Eckhart even at this stage. It is indeed striking how little change there is in the principal structures of his thought between this exciting early work and the latter, more sophisticated sermons of his maturity. In 1302, Eckhart left Erfurt to return to Paris, this time in order to take up the Dominican chair in theology. And it is possible that during this period he wrote some of the extensive scriptural commentaries composed exclusively in Latin that survive from his hand. Eckhart's success as an academic theologian was matched by his popularity as an administrator. In 1303, he was named the first provincial of the new Dominican province of Saxonia, a post which seems to have been held with great ability and energy. By him, that is, like, he seems to have held it that way, yeah. In 1311, despite an attempt to lure him to the province of Teutonia, Eckhart was sent back to Paris to the same Dominican chair he had occupied a decade previously. Thus, in addition to receiving high administrative honors, Eckhart twice held a chair in theology at the University of Paris, an achievement which he has common only with the greatest of Dominican theologians, Thomas Aquinas. Eckhart's next move was to Strasbourg in the year 1313, where he served as vicar general with oversight of many women's convents in southwest Germany. This move was out of the ordinary in that a Parisian professor would generally return to his native province. Eckhart's arrival in Strasbourg was probably the result of decrees formulated at the Council of Vienne, 1311 to 1312, which had accused a number of religious women known as beingness of holding heretical views. The many beingness communities of continental Europe had for some time represented a challenge to the bishops, in that these devout women with temporary vows and sometimes practicing mendicancy, begging, did not fall easily into any of these distinct categories for women's religious life. During the 13th century, they were increasingly seen as a threat, culminating in two decrees which accused beingness of harboring the so-called heresy of the free spirit, which supposedly taught that a soul in union with God was freed from conventional moral constraints. Although there was also an attempt to distinguish between good and bad beingness. Interesting. So we actually see this as I can see this as a power play at the time. It's fundamentally, they weren't built into the existing power bases. I don't really identify as a feminist by any means, but this is medieval period. There was some degree of misogyny, I'm sure. And what this, I suppose, but generally, you could see this as basically the existing hierarchy of the clergy seeing that which does not fit into that hierarchy as a threat to the hierarchy. Or maybe it was a parallel hierarchy, but in any case, yes, and that which did not fit into, whether it's ideas, in terms of ideas, or literally just organizational structure, the existing hierarchies would have been seen as a threat, and heresy was a tool for the clergy to use as a way to clear a proposition, basically. So, yeah. And it's interesting that it talks about the idea of the soul in union with God freed from conventional moral constraints. I mean, this is something actually talked about by Seekers of Unity, a YouTube channel that I interviewed the guy, actually. It's a pretty interesting conversation. If you haven't heard it, check that out. But yeah, he was talking about this the other day, like about how mysticism, especially if you become present, but even prior to that point, there's this issue of it transcends duality and thus transcends typical ideas of right and wrong in morality. But the question is, how do we act in a way that's serving others and harmonious with others and nature and the divine? How do we guide our actions without some kind of, oh wait, I have to stop there. Sorry, there's numerology. 1313 was just a time, right? But earlier, just as I was reading, I noticed, and I thought of numerology when I noticed this, I said, Eckhart's next move was to Strasbourg in the year 1313. And I was like, huh, that's numerology. And then, you know, it's 1313 now. And I'm just going to point that out, right? That's pretty cool. I can't remember what the actual symbolic meaning of 4 is, because that's 13. Okay, 13, 1, 3 kind of makes 4. But if it's 1, 3, that could also make 8. 8 maybe means infinity, but 4, I can't remember actually what that means. But yeah, I would look that up if you want to, because you might, I don't know, if you know numerology, then you might find that interesting that came up. But yeah, I thought I'd mention it. Yeah, where was I? Yeah, so there's the, I wonder if the numerology here, given the timing, if it has to do with the non-duality and the unison of opposites and presence, which is connection to the divine, and in presence is source, in the moment is source. That's where the divine guidance comes from. But and so that's the answer to how do we guide our behavior without a moral system when we're in mysticism, right? And the answer is intuition. But it needs to actually be intuition. It can't be do what you want and just call it intuition, because that's just an excuse for potentially self-serving behavior. What it has to be is, well, truly tuning and resonating with the frequency of love and authenticity and intuitively connecting like that, and letting source or your higher self or what have you guide you, maybe spirit guides as well. That doesn't mean you never think anything through at all, but you always allow that to be a guidance, the guiding hand of the divine in your actions, and you can be an instrument or a conduit for that energy in a sense. Of course, you have free will, and your free will means, so you're not like some sort of puppet, you're more like in a divine dance with the divine, right? You can choose how you manifest it, but if you want to be in tune, if you want to be serving others and in tune with the universe, yeah, you would want a co-creation with it, right? So even though you're freely choosing, you're choosing to align and harmonize. That doesn't mean you don't have free will or that you're restricted. It's a choice. And yeah, and it's not a choice that gives away your free will. I mean, that's actually what service itself is about, giving away your free will. Either giving away your free will or taking away others' free will. Or potentially in a hierarchy where you lose free will to those above you and you take away from hierarchy, you take away from those below you in a hierarchy or something. Whether it's a literal hierarchy or a hierarchy of force. Actually, no. From listening to Aaron Apke's most recent video, and also I guess to myself and what makes sense and other things I've come across, there's this, I have a sense that, what was I going to say? I don't know. Sorry. I'll probably come to me in a sec. So yeah, that service itself is like It's actually getting people to agree to it, consent to it. Whether or not they realize they're consenting to it, it's getting them to consent to it. So, for example, given the C word, that might be relevant at the moment, depending on when you hear this, people have to agree to it. And even if they come to your door and you think you don't have a choice, you do. If you just do not consent to a certain medical procedure regarding the C word, even if it seems like a situation where you've got a gun to your head or something, which is unlikely, but even if it were, somehow it transpire that you'll end up not having it and you'll be all right if you choose not to, by unknown means, and you've just got to trust it. We always consent, right? It's just we don't necessarily realize that we consent. And people might ask, what about the young children who are so vulnerable they don't? I don't know. I guess soul contracts before they're born. I don't know. Some people we choose our. That sounds really heartless to say, but we choose our tests and our catalysts, and then what we go through early on, relating to our karma. But I'm digressing. The point is, we actually always have consent if we're aware of how it works, but it doesn't work the way we typically think of it. So, so it's like a slick politician. Something that came to mind when I was thinking about it yesterday actually was a typical example from my experience, and I don't know if you're into anime at all, but there's an anime called Hunter x Hunter, and what's the guy called? There's this blonde guy who's like this really, there's this election arc, and there's this guy who's he's just really good at swaying people, but he's actually full of hate. Anyway, I'm digressing, but he's a typical example of it. But you get smooth politicians. Tony Blair is an example of a service to self person, right? I mean, all this suave smoothness and charisma, but really he's completely self-serving. That's my impression anyway. So, yeah, I mean, that's how people can be just use intimidation. But if you fall and not be suave at all, but if you go along with with it when they intimidate you, you're consenting. You might think, okay, but that's false because they might hurt you otherwise. But you're choosing to go along with that as opposed to be hurt. You could choose to be hurt and not to cooperate. That's why there is consent in some situations where we typically think of it as coercion. Not that coercion doesn't. I mean, sometimes in order to not to consent to something, it might require death, but maybe that's preferable to compromising your integrity and or frequency or whatever. But normally it doesn't involve that or require that. Anyway, that was one of my classic tangents. So we were talking about morality and how we can guide our actions and intuition, and morphic resonance came to mind instead. Rupert Sheldrake talks about that. Basically, what resonates, intuition, following your heart, love, and all that. That is the answer. I mean, people say love is the answer. I know it's a bit, what was it? You know what I mean? It's like people roll their eyes when they hear that, but it's true. So, one of these decrees specifically refers to the problem of the beguines in the German lands, and both probably reflect the influence of the two German prelates at the council, John of Zurich, Bishop of Strasbourg, and Henry II of Wernberg, Archbishop of Cologne. Yeah, those titles sound so kingly, which kind of represents the corruption of Catholicism and how hierarchical it was. Not like Gnosticism and stuff, which is much more, what Christianity is really about. But even in Catholicism, there was mysticism, like Meister Eckhart. So, yeah. The political connotations of the Vienne decrees were immense in that the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who were responsible for many of the Beguine communities, which were often loosely affiliated to one another or the Mendicant orders. Yeah, it was them who were responsible for that. So that put more power in terms of these orders and took power away from those women. Eckhart's move to Strasbourg, then, can be easily viewed as an attempt by the Dominican order to protect its own interests in the face of an imminent conflict with the bishops. This would center on the condemnation of certain women for whom they, the Dominicans, bore a close pastoral responsibility. So it's basically like, look, we're not responsible, it's those women. And they were basically, in order to not lose power, they were making it, those women get the fall for it. And we can see there was a rivalry between the Dominican order and the Franciscan order. My impression of it is that the Dominicans were much more they had a mystical streak, perhaps, to some degree, and were more studious. And the Franciscans were much more ascetic, Puritan, perhaps. I'm oversimplifying. I'm sure I am, but that's my impression. This would center on the condemnation of certain women for whom they, the Dominicans, bore a close pastoral responsibility. It was probably during this period in Strasbourg that Eckhart's own troubles began. It was here that he wrote the Liber Benedictus, the Book of Divine Consolation, and On the Noble Man, both included in the present selection. And we will begin to hear references to those who do not understand, suggesting that Eckhart himself was becoming subject to criticism. Also, much of the material which was used in the first trial of his work during the subsequent period of Cologne was taken from the Liber Benedictus. But when Meister Eckhart arrived in Cologne in around 1323, he came as a leading Christian scholar and senior figure within the Dominican order. And yet, in 1325, Nicholas of Strasbourg, who was both the papal visitor to the Dominican province of Teutonia and Eckhart's academic subordinate, conducted an investigation into his work, pronouncing it to be orthodox. That's convenient, but yeah, it is impossible not to see this as an attempt to preempt a more serious attempt from the Archbishop of Cologne, who did, however, initiate inquisitorial proceedings against Eckhart in 1326. The charge against him was the grave one of heresy, and it was in certain respects an extraordinary accusation. Eckhart was both the first and only Dominican to be charged with heresy under the Inquisition, and he was also the first theologian of major rank to face this particular charge. Controversial theologians were otherwise subjected to an examination of faith, since heresy was a matter of the will and not merely the propagation of theological error. It is notable that the charge against him was immediately reduced when his case was finally referred to the Holy See. Eckhart responded to the list of suspect propositions drawn up by his accusers with a written defense which has survived. It is significant that the attitude adopted by Eckhart in this and at other points in his defense is not that he was introducing new teachings which were either different or superior to the doctrines of the Catholic Church, but rather that he was within the Orthodox tradition and was being misunderstood. If his accusers charged Eckhart with heresy, then he charged them with stupidity. When his case moved to Avignon, where Pope John the 22nd, that's really original, isn't it? Was currently in exile, he was flanked by Henricus de Signo, the Dominican provincial of Teutonia, and 3 lectors. Despite such a strong local support, there is some evidence to support that suggests that the Dominican order at large had already distanced itself from Eckhart during its general chapter at Venice in 1325. And politically and strategically, this kind of makes sense in terms of realpolitik. Yeah, it makes sense that they would do that, I suppose. This duly followed on 27th of March 1329, shortly after Eckhart's death, with the publication of the bull In Agro Dominico. This identified 28 articles, 17 of which were judged to contain the mark of the error or mark of heresy, and 11 of which were evil-sounding, rash, and suspect of heresy, and 11 of which were evil. And we have already indicated the extraordinary character of the accusations against Eckhart, and his condemnation is no less strange. You might, like me, have be reminded of cancel culture and the like there, because these days we do have this idea that someone's ideas and their speech are just like unacceptable, completely unacceptable, and whether literally or not, they're put on trial. Generally not literally, but at least when it comes to public opinion or institutions in some sense. Yeah, that does tend to happen. So it's just like the same patterns repeat in new forms, especially when you keep in mind that astrologically and in the cycles of time, like there's the same patterns repeating, and often souls reincarnate and repeat the same patterns. So yeah, it can change the way it manifests the patterns, but yeah, they do repeat. We have already indicated the extraordinary character of the accusations against Eckhart, and his condemnation is no less strange. In the first place, it was published only in Cologne, although Eckhart had also lived and taught in German in Erfurt and Strasbourg. Secondly, the bull was published after his death, when any threat from Eckhart's preaching, if threat there was, could reasonably be considered to have passed. To this extent, In Agro Dominico stands out as a condemnatory text without parallel in the history of the Catholic medieval Europe. Now, if you consider that this is it's mysticism, you will understand more as you hear it, the readings of the text itself. And even though Eckhart was very clear that it's within the Orthodox tradition, and he was probably honest about that, that was his perception, there are definitely some mystic themes in this, and I don't think the establishment at the time would have been happy with that. There have been secret societies, and either call it Cabal, the Illuminati, or whatever. I imagine that the strange nature and the very political nature of the accusations and the way he was dealt with, or these issues were dealt with at the time, represents something involving secret societies. That's just my impression. Those who've done research at the Catholic Church might know that their connection with secret societies and the dark side of the occult is very deep. It's very deep. And yeah. So I'll continue. But there is, in fact, a single, perfectly consistent explanation for all the unusual factors that surround the accusation against Eckhart and his condemnation. It was the Archbishop of Cologne who instigated inquisitorial proceedings against Eckhart and who opposed Eckhart's appeal to the Holy See. It was Henry, too, who wrote to John the 22nd, evoking the assurance that the condemnation would be pronounced despite Eckhart's death. The fact that the bull was promulgated only in Cologne well illustrates Henry's key influence in the affair. So, I mean, this is basically that the establishment was felt threatened by mystical ideas being spread because there was an orthodox tradition and hierarchy and system of control, and that was in place, and they wanted it to remain in place, unchanged. They didn't want people actually questioning and getting to spiritual awakening or anything like that. No. People need to be in low emotions of guilt and shame and fear. After all, that's what the Catholic Church and Christianity, or at least the establishment that has been establishments that have controlled Christianity have wanted and been doing. So yeah. And we need only inquire why it was that the Pope felt himself unable to oppose Henry, or as we might have expected, simply to allow the case to sit on the shelf, because popes are puppets. The condemnation of head of state also puppets, and the Pope is a head of state. What am I going to say? The condemnation of a prominent Dominican can only have embarrassed the Pope and his close ally, the Dominican order. A clear answer to this question emerges from a consideration of the political situation in which the papacy found itself in the first decades of the 14th century. Since the exile of the papacy to Avignon in 1309, Clement V and his successor John the 22nd entertained the ambition to return to Italy. In particular, the latter viewed the Italian ambitions of Louis of Bavaria, the German emperor, with great foreboding. Fearing that the incursions into Italy by Louis would destroy his hope of returning to Rome with a benign Habsburg buffer to the north. Accordingly, the Pope engaged in a fierce controversy with Louis, which culminated in his excommunication in 1324. Henry of Wurtemberg's role in this complex political situation was that of chief supporter of Louis's challenger to the throne, the Habsburg Frederick of Austria, and he was thus one of John the 22nd's principal allies. The geopolitics is really interesting to me here. Because if you understand geopolitics, you can really understand service of self logic and how they operate. Because given that for a long time they've been a kind of ruler of the world, and that service of self is that which is not, and that which is service to others, sort of thing. Like, you can understand, duality allows you to understand the opposite, right? And so you can understand what you are through that which you are not, and vice versa. And it's through the unison of opposites you get to unity, right? After all, you need to integrate your shadow. And the collective of humanity needs to do that too. Which requires seeing all these things that are coming out and will continue to come out about the horrific things that have been going on beneath the surface, and not just recognizing and accepting that these have been going on, but that the potential in every human being is there to engage in such actions. And that choice of polarity is available. It's part of reality and part of human potential. And when that is acknowledged and integrated, the collective consciousness of humanity will be able to love itself. And that will enable fundamentally the opening of the heart chakra en masse, right? So, and that will be the turning point. But it can't happen all at once, obviously, and we've got to be ready for it. And it takes time for this to happen. And there's an astrological schedule to this as well. So the reason I talked about that is just because it felt right to talk about it then. So where was I? The extent of the Pope's obligation to the Archbishop can be judged by a letter which John wrote to Henry on the 3rd of June, 1324, in which he urged him to publish the process against Lewis, which he had so far failed to do on account of local opposition. As an enticement, the Pope offered to force the return of whatever toll rights King Albrecht had removed from him during the toll war in the Rhineland area. All the Archbishop had to do was inform him of the present owners of such rights, who the present owners of such rights were. This letter clearly shows that shortly before the trial against Eckhart began, the Pope believed himself to be so indebted to the Archbishop of Cologne as to explicitly offer him favors. So there we go. Honestly, the Catholic Church has always been corrupt as fuck. I mean, this just shows that at the time that was the case. It's the case now. It absolutely is. And I've heard certain things about Trump's activity when he was going to certain places around the world where, and basically, the videos I was watching were saying, like, he was saying that he was kind of coercing them or getting them to support him because he had stuff on them, right? But I don't know if that's true. I'm not going to be like a Trump fanboy. It's tempting at times, but yeah, it's he has a role to play in the awakening, whether it's catalyst, whether it's a light worker, whether it's both, whether he's a light worker and dark worker. You know, sometimes you get someone who on an egoic level is acting dark, but on a soul level is doing a service for humanity during the time of awakening. I wonder if even Bill Gates and his activity is represents that. So there's multiple layers. Reality is a fractal infinite onion. So like, there's always more layers to things. This letter, finally, the question must be asked why Henry of Wurmberg should have felt himself provoked by Meister Eckhart to the extent of pursuing him mercilessly by all the means at his disposal. The answer probably lies in Henry's campaign against the Benguins. Not only did Eckhart become involved in that controversy on behalf of the Dominican order, and thus indirectly on behalf of the Benguins themselves, who were their pastoral charges, but also he himself seemed, to an unsympathetic mind, to be teaching the very heresy of which the Benguins stood accused. In sermons attributed to Eckhart, it is not difficult to read certain statements removed from their context as advocating a mystical religion which is potentially free of ethical content. I mean, I think he's a mystic, but yeah. Indeed, it is very likely that his sermons were read in this way in certain quarters. Eckhart himself was aware that there was such a subtly put but rhetorical elan, but in his defense, he also disclaimed a number of statements attributed to his name. Also, of course, he frequently warned against such an antinomian misinterpretation of his thought, stressing the place of morality and of the practices of the church. With hindsight, we know today that Meister Eckhart emphatically taught the Christian faith, albeit in a highly original manner, and with certain philosophical presuppositions which lent his thought a wholly distinctive edge. But the distasteful events surrounding his trial point not only to the political machinations of the age, but they also remind us how easy it is to misread Meister Eckhart and to misappropriate his teachings for purposes remote from his own. It would probably be good for me to keep that in mind, but my intuition is that even though he was fundamentally looking at things from a framing that was Catholic, even if he intended it to be orthodox, what shines through is a mystical truth which his framing cannot hide. And from what I know of his principles so far, yeah, I very much think that's the case, and we will see. So, to some extent, this was the consequence of his own occasional predilection for quite extravagant rhetoric, but it was also the result of the discrepancy between the deep structures of his thought and the brilliant surface of his imagery and language. Moreover, the failure to see any single part of Eckhart's work within the context of the whole, and the whole in the context of his intellectual and social world, remains as much a danger now as it was then. Right, so intellectual foundation. We're still in the introduction, mind, but yeah. Once again, it is Meister Eckhart's status as a Dominican which is of importance as we assess the intellectual influences upon him. Since his entrance into the Dominican order guaranteed him an immensely privileged education and status as the finest and access to the finest libraries, there is little philosophical or theological material extant in the medieval West that which we can assume Meister Eckhart did not read. This is in marked contrast to the great majority of medieval writers, for whom access to text was severely restricted on practical grounds. But most importantly of all, the education Eckhart received significantly as a German Dominican proved to be a fundamental influence upon his thought. The existence of a German Dominican school centering upon the figure of Albert the Great has only recently been fully established. It has been shown to be a radical form of Augustinianism, particularly indebted to the Neoplatonic influence, among others, Proclus, a Greek, and Avicenna, an Arab, and Maimonides, a Jew. It is in this association, rather than the more general Dominican trends which Eckhart has in common with Thomas Aquinas, that makes Eckhart such a challenging thinker. Now, keep in mind that the Gnostics, my impression is that there's a link between the Neoplatonic thought and the Gnostics. I don't know if that's true, but yeah, and there's certain mystical aspects of Plato's thought. So yeah. One of the foremost representatives of this German Dominican school was Dietrich of Freiburg. Dietrich belonged to the generation before that of Meister Eckhart, but like him, he was an outstanding administrator and scholar, who also held a chair of theology at the University of Paris. Dietrich must have been Eckhart's mentor in the Dominican order, and as provincial of Teutonia, would have appointed the younger man prior of the Dominican convent at Erfurt. The two works by his hand, which are of most consequence to us, are On the Intellect and On the Beatific Vision. We do not find in Eckhart a treatise on the intellect as such, but the theory of intellect, which is everywhere present in his works, is virtually identical to that held by Dietrich and expounded in these two texts. The key area that Eckhart has in common with Dietrich and others of the German Dominican school is an intense interest in nature and the meaning of intellect, by which is meant something that corresponds more to consciousness than to intellect, in modern terminology. For our present purposes, Eckhart's chief debt was his belief that mind or intellect exists insofar as it is dynamically active. To the extent of consciousness is existent, is its activity. I wonder if that relates to frequency, because frequency is a sort of energetic activity, right? So perhaps consciousness can be at higher or lower frequencies, and the extent of consciousness is its frequency. That might sound like a stretch, but I do feel like there's a connection there. It may even indirectly be linked with mentalism in the law of one, but and hermeticism. I think loosely, but yeah. The degree to which the mind is active, and therefore the degree to which it exists, is determined by the actuality of that which it knows. Intellect, therefore, can be said to attain varying degrees of existence, and thus depends on the extent to which it is activated, which depends in turn on the degree of actuality of the object with which it engages. That sounds like mentalism to me. The idea of us creating our own reality with our minds, and of different frequencies. It's sort of polarity, it's a scale, and also maybe even free will and consciousness, and that the extent to which we exert it will depend on how much that flame of consciousness is burning. Is it a little tiny flame or spark shrouded with darkness, or is it a violet, intense violet flame that lightens up all around it, you know? It depends. It could be a tiny red little flame. And yes, I'm indirectly referring to the chakras here. After all, the crown chakra is violet and the root chakra is red. So, also degree in the actuality of the object which engages. What is the actuality of the object? Maybe it is actually determinant on the mind. Thus, the concept of intellect is an appropriate one to describe the nature of God, who is all-knowing and all-being. In the case of source, consciousness, presence, that is being, and it is unlimited, and it's a pool or well that does no bottom, and it's full access to the Akashic records potentially. That's what source does. It just depends on how much the clutter is cleared up, or the rogue programming, or whatever you might call it. Ego can generally get in the way, and ego is kind of rogue programming. It's programming that instead of working for the source or the consciousness, it's working counter to it and trying to exert its own control and authority or whatever, right? Now, if you think about The Matrix, the film, what's going on with it could be explained, it could all be about the mind, and in a sort of as above, so below sense. So the mind of the human consciousness, or as a whole, or individually. Because like there's Agent Smith represents the ego. This is what I'm picking up on now. And Neo is the one. And basically the whole story could be the Dark Night of the Soul experience of the one first has to realize he's to have awakening, that he realizes that he's more than just this 9-to-5 job that he hates, right? The drudgery or whatever he's going through in his life. He's more than that. And then he picks up on synchronicities like was it Follow the White Rabbit, and like seeing a woman in red twice or something like that. And you know, there are certain things where in the Matrix they come up and something's going to go down, right? If that's the case. Like when Agent Smith first arrives to attack him, I think that's the case. Yeah, there was a signal just before that that he picked up on, and been told that if this happens, you know, I'm getting too stuck on the details. The point is that it represents the ego, and there's this. They had a fight, but in the end, they unified. It's awakening, and for humanity generally, we need to come out of that. The same old routine that is established, this idea of the things that we feel like we have to be doing, or the escapism that we're doing. You know, it could be like what indulgence, if you've got the position to do that, you know, or not, you know, the indulgence in the distractions, like and service of self is represented by, I'm sorry, for some reason I can't remember the name, but you know, the guy who he awakened, so to speak, but he rejected the one, and instead went and decided, well, I'll just dwell in the Matrix, but like have all these luxuries and stuff because he enjoys it, right? I mean, that's negative polarity. That serves the up self. But there is a sense in which one polarity kind of serves the other as a sort of catalyst, and it's all one ultimately. That maybe that is behind me stumbling over words like that. But yeah, he so that represents choosing ego even after awakening, I guess. And the alternative, Neo, represents choosing the one, I suppose. And there's almost like a twin flame thing going on between him and Neo and wow, you can tell I really know my movies, huh? I can't remember her name, but yeah, he saves her or whatever. He chooses love. He doesn't just go, oh, pragmatically, we have to save the people, and so I need to sacrifice her. I mean, I can understand that logic, but he doesn't go for that. He's like, no. I choose her. But then he found a way to save his people even while doing that, which is unison of opposites, again, which is, so unity is a theme in that. I do have the sense that the people who did the Matrix are like old souls or starseeds or something, probably. Yeah, so I didn't expect to talk about the Matrix, but okay. What am I going to call this? Meister Eckhart and the Matrix? You wouldn't expect them to go together, but yeah. So the extent of one's consciousness determines one's power in the matrix, and this matrix is it's multi-dimensional reality essentially, but it's also in incarnation. Out of the matrix completely would be maybe when you're in the spirit world or whatever, right? But we're here, and your power, so to speak, your influence mentally, your mental influence on reality, your traction, power of your traction, the degree to which you we own a dream within a dream within a dream sort of thing, right? And it's clay with our mind, whether we're consciously or not, we're influencing reality around us and our experience. So the degree of your frequency or consciousness, the intensity which it burns, you know, that affects our power, so to speak. And power can be used through service to others or service to self, or neutrally, whatever. There's a polarity to that, but power is power anyway. And yeah, the potency of that attractive force, that influence over reality. And we see that with Neo as he gets more powerful in the trilogy. It's his, not just belief, his knowing that he can jump over that gap, right, is what allows him to do it. And we have no idea of our potential, right? So many of us, we have no idea, but the process of that awakening is at hand, I suppose. Yeah, so thus the concept of intellect is an appropriate one to describe the nature of God, who is all-knowing and all-being. In the case of human beings, however, the intellect is locked in a body and in a world of objects whose reality is distinctly less than that of God and the divine realm. Accordingly, the human intellect is generally only partially actualized. Secondly, from Dietrich's On the Beatific Vision, Eckhart took the idea that the human soul is itself intellect. Now you might be able to see how it connects together here with what I was saying and the matrix. In technical terms, this was the identification of the Augustinian ground of the soul with the Aristotelian agent intellect, which is, by the way, this is genius, this is fantastic. I love this. That combination is, yeah, I love that. He must have been getting downloads, whether or not he realized it or not. Which meant for Eckhart, our essence, which is our innermost part, is itself intellect. So we are mind, we are consciousness, we are the source, we are that being. If you go back a bit, thus, the concept of intellect is an appropriate one to describe the nature of God, who is all-knowing and all-being. So God is all-knowing and all-being, and is all-being. Now, what are we? We are being. So the soul is intellect. So the soul is the essence, which the soul is intellect, and intellect is God, and God is all-knowing and all-being, and it is consciousness. So all those things are the same thing, and so the soul is God. It's all the same essence, and he got that, right? And so it's fundamentally mystical. It says it right here. It says it's right here, and it's talking directly about what Eckhart was saying. So he may have thought it was orthodox, maybe he did, but like, this is like straight out of Hermeticism, straight out of like, this is law of one level, mentalism, pantheism. That's exactly what I'm saying here. Yeah. Secondly, Okay, wait. That's where I was. Therefore, in order to locate and explore mind in this most dynamic and radical sense, we must look within to the most interior and intimate part of our being. Although Meister Eckhart owed a great deal to his fellow German Dominicans, the tenor of his thought is markedly different from that of both Dietrich and Albert the Great. He does not share their encyclopedic and scientific tendencies. Also, in Eckhart's case, a boldly speculative intellectualist philosophy takes on a mystical and personal contours which are lacking in his contemporaries. The works of Dietrich or Albert Ulrich of Strasbourg or Hugh Rippelin are for the specialist, while Eckhart's sermons still unfadingly excite, provoke, and challenge the general reader. Nor are we alone in making that judgment, since Dietrich and Eckhart's contemporaries chose to preserve the sermons of the latter and not of the former. The difference between them can perhaps be summed up by the atmosphere of urgency which prevails in Eckhart's works, and which makes us feel that he bears a great burden of truth. Indeed, we can feel in Eckhart the preacher a sense of the presence of God, which underlies all his thinking, and which lends it an astonishing communicative power. If the structure of Eckhart's thought is largely that of philosophical movement which dominated German Dominican circles during the second half of the 13th and first half of the 14th centuries, the spirit which animates it is entirely his own. And I'm wondering, what star sign was it? Does it say the exact date he was born? No, it doesn't. It only says the year. I am curious about what the astrological situation was that year, but it doesn't tell us the details of like what month he was born in or whatever. So, all right. I've sensed something going on for quite a while, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Meister Eckhart's thoughts. I'll tell you what, I'll finish off here, actually. So the next episode, which I'll record in a sec, but it'll be second episode. Yeah, will be Meister Eckhart's thought. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed me reading the introduction of this, and I've been looking forward to this, to be honest. So, Oh, yeah, check out that picture there. If you're watching on YouTube, there are these two monks or something, and they're holding this round thing in the middle, and there's this angel-like thing above them. It seems to represent unison of opposites. Yeah. So have a good day, and bye for now.